By a show of hands, who here is motivated by the speech that the professor just delivered?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now, I'd like to begin the conversation by broaching the topic of poverty. Marlene Bart Williams gave a TED talk in Berlin in 2015, where she said, "I come from the richest country in the world. It is located in the richest continent in the world. That country is Sierra Leone." Now, she unleashed her venom on the West by portraying Africa and Sierra Leone's resources as a sort of elephantiasis from whose gorged flesh the lifeblood is being sucked. Now, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair said in 2001, "African poverty is a scar on the conscience of the world." Now, juxtaposed together, these two comments are pretty much evocative of the black box that poverty on the African continent has come to represent. In the land of plenty, it is estimated that about 80% of Africans suffer from hunger. I'd like to offer you the majesty of reason to tease out the dominant forces that have shaped or perpetuated poverty on the African continent, in your opinion, and if you can shed light on why and how poverty has become so intractable.
Let me start by saying that indeed hunger and poverty are pervasive in most African countries. But there is also a reality that Africans, whenever they have been focused, have addressed the problem of poverty and hunger in a very practical way. And I want to give 3 examples of countries, or 4 examples of countries which have dealt with the question of hunger, and I'll use the word hunger and food shortage. In 1983, a young army officer called Thomas Sankara took over power in a country that was then known as Upper Volta, and he renamed it Burkina Faso. And the first thing that he said is that we cannot be a country that cannot feed ourselves. What he then did, among other things, is to recognize that some of these grand ideas about irrigation and all do not address the problems at hand immediately. He reminded the people that traditionally we had means and ways of addressing our problems. What became of the granary, he asked. What became of the kitchen gardens, he asked. And between 1983 and 1987, when he was assassinated, it is true that largely the household income in Burkina Faso had improved, and nutrition levels had improved, and the quality of lives had improved. Maternal mortality had been addressed, infant mortality had been addressed, and this was done through the ability and the resources which were domestic, demonstrating to me that sometimes we think that all our solutions must come from outside, while indeed they can come from within us. The other country is Malawi. When President Mbingu wa Mutharika became the president, Mbingu wa Mutharika, who had worked with the World Bank for a very long time, said there is no reason why we cannot improve our agriculture and ensure that we are food sufficient. We rely on maize, or corn as you call it in the United States of America, and within 3 years, the production of corn in Malawi improved exponentially, and we were importing corn. Even Kenya and East African countries were importing corn from Malawi. The third country is Rwanda post-genocide. Many of you know that in 1994, the economy of Rwanda was on a total shutdown. No economic activity, absolutely. Today you go to Rwanda under different schemes that have been introduced by the government, the most recent of which is 1 cow per family, which is succeeding. Out of the 10 families that have received cows, 4 have failed, but 6 are succeeding. And what we can begin to see is that the quality of people's lives are succeeding. In Kenya, there have also been schemes where that has been achieved. And one can go on and on. In Botswana. So I am of the considered view that if you have local solutions to local problems, then you can begin to address the basic problem. Because what is poverty? Let us also define what poverty is. There are places where if you don't have a television set, then you are poor. There are places where if you don't have a second car in the home, then you are poor. There are places where if you have no access to mortgage, then you are poor. There are places where if you don't have access to some of these luxuries, you are poor. But in many African societies, what are we concerned about? We want food to be in the household. We want children to have access to education. We have expectant mothers to have access to medical facilities. We want children to be vaccinated. And if therefore you define poverty in a culturally specific way, then you will redefine poverty very differently. But it is true that in quite a number of African countries, there has also been a problem of poverty. And you cite Sierra Leone. Part of the reason why Sierra Leone found herself where she did was the Civil War. Part of the reason why Liberia found herself where she was is the Civil War. Part of the reason why you find South Sudan finding herself and Darfur where she is the Civil War. Part of the reason why Somalia was where she was is the Civil War. Part of the reason why Ethiopia had problems it no longer does was the Civil War. So these conflicts in Africa also deny people the opportunity to participate in agriculture and to participate in economic activities. And the net effect, therefore, is that when you look at the question of poverty from a Eurocentric standpoint, you are quick to judge African countries as being poor. Look at Angola, for example, during the entire period of the Civil War in the 1970s through to 1985. The reason why you could not farm in Angola is because mines had been planted everywhere, and therefore agricultural activity was not possible. You'll find that oil fields in South Sudan cannot be exploited because they have been blown up. So I'm very slow to judge Africa in that regard. But I say so, warning myself that part of the reason why we should address conflicts in Africa is to create environments where we can indeed address these problems. And I conclude my answer with the ongoing problem in Nigeria between the pastoralists and the farmers. If you look at traditional ways in which land was being dealt with in many African societies, these conflicts could be mediated through traditional practices. But when we change land tenure systems and we introduce absolute ownership and leaseholds, and we fence off lands and we then individuate the title, then conflicts which are manufactured because of foreign practices undermine the manner in which we deal with issues. So in a nutshell, I want to conclude by saying it is true that Africa does suffer from the pain of poverty, but it is equally true that Africa has demonstrated that she is capable of solving her problems from means and methods that are homegrown. And lastly, it is also true that Africa has now recognized that in order to realize her potential and to immunize herself from these difficulties, she must begin to address the things that militate against the realization of long-term solutions. And one of them, as we have already noted under pillars, the 7 pillars of Africa Agenda 2063, is to silence the guns by the year 2020. And number 2, to ensure that pervasive and pernicious and diabolical foreign influence is eliminated by the year 2025.
I'll ask one question and open to the floor. Professor, you've expressed admiration for Thomas Sankara, for Patrice Lumumba, some of the great minds and revolutionary leaders that Africa has had. It's also true that some of those leaders were betrayed by the citizenry, which begs the question, is Africa ready for a revolutionary leader?
The question is, who is a revolutionary leader? And he is revolting against what and about what? And I say this because immediately after the independence in Mozambique, Samora Machel, whom I enjoin many of you to read about, surprised his audience, because in many countries which were colonized by the Portuguese, the clarion call was always "a luta continua." But on this occasion he asked, "A luta continua." When they responded, "A luta continua," he says, "A luta continua contra qué?" The struggle continues for what? And he answered the question. The struggle continues for the changing of our lives, he said, in our health sector, in our education sector, in our agricultural sector, in our schools, in our homes, in our environment. And it is true that in many African countries, the political leadership succeeds in mobilizing the people negatively using ethnicity. A Kenyan writer called Koigi Wawamwere has written a book entitled The Curse of Negative Ethnicity Towards Genocide in Kenya. And in one of the pages he says that the bankrupt politician hypnotizes members of his community like a python does to his prey, and convinces them that your problems emanate from other ethnicities, while indeed that is completely untrue. And you can see that in many communities, and some of you who are from, my good friend here who is from the Sudan, who is from among the Fur people, the land of the Darfur, if you ask what is the conflict in Darfur, what is the problem between Khartoum and Darfur? What is the problem in South Sudan? It is because the politicians have succeeded in persuading the people that your long-term health not only requires but demands that one from your ethnicity must be in positions of power. But you who are here in the United States of America, with all our problems, you know that systems work. I'm told, just to tell you how problems are at different levels, that prisoners in Norway were complaining that their television sets and television did not have sufficient programs. These fellows programs to watch in prison. Do they know what a prison is? So they are at a totally different level in terms of examining their problems. So I'm submitting that there is a sense in which we Africans are also co-authors of our own misfortune. How so? In many places, the population must make demands of their leaders in an organized way. If you go to Europe and America, largely people demand that certain things should be done. Many of you Africans will say, but if you demand, you'll be killed. Sometimes it happens. A few must be killed so that the others who remain can benefit. That is the reality. Only recently I went to Zambia. I was denied entry. They say I was a danger to security. I don't know whether it was my security or the Zambian security. But for some reason they say I was a danger. So I'm saying to when I was there, I say, perhaps it needs for me to be denied entry into a few more countries and others to be denied. So I'm saying that each one of us has a contribution to make. It is very easy to resign. It is very easy for you to come to Nairobi, Kenya upon graduation. You get your LLM and get your SJD and you become a professor and you can leave, you can drive your 4x4 and it's very easy. But it is also necessary to take the path that some people take. It's a painful path. There must be martyrs. So it's not going to be easy. So if you look at some of the individuals who have made changes and contributed positively to their country, they have always been prepared to make a sacrifice. The question is, what sacrifice are you prepared to make? When you are sitting here, what sacrifice are you prepared to make? If you want to live safely, then you can live safely. But remember these words of Martin Niemöller, which I remind every student. Martin Niemöller in 1945 said, when they came for the socialists, I said nothing because I was not a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I said nothing because I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I said nothing because I was not a Jew. And when they came for me, there was nobody to say anything. So there is a sense in which we must always remind ourselves that we have a contribution to make. And I say this in concluding to answer your question. You know, when you are young, you have this idea that you are God's gift to the world. That immediately you graduate, your country will change because of your contribution. That is when you are 20. When you become 30, you discover that you cannot change the world. Now you begin to say, now I'll change my country. And when you are 40, you discover that you cannot even change your country. Then when you are 50, you think you can change your village. You discover that the contradictions in the village are too many, you cannot even change your village. Then when you are 60, you now discover that you can change your family, and you discover that your family want to be free, so they don't want to be changed. Then when you are 70, old, and generally you don't know what to do, you only discover that it's you that you ought to have changed. My own view is, you change yourself and make your little contribution in your little corner. And that is the contribution you make. And you'll be amazed. When I look at the world now, and I travel across, there's a friend of mine from Liberia. I don't know whether he has left. But there is a group of young Liberians whom I met who had planned to traverse to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And they made a decision, we are not crossing. Today they run cyber cafes in Monrovia. They are employers. That is their contribution. So your contribution can be a contribution, however modest it is. And the truth is, the people that we cite in Africa, such as Thomas Sankara, Machel, Nyerere, and others, they are the more visible ones. But they are amazing people who are not publicized, who are doing amazing things. This young man here from Nigeria, he's doing amazing things already in the technological sector, already has a foothold in the Silicon Valley and in Abuja in Nigeria, but you do not know about it. Does he have to win a Nobel Prize for you to know about it? He need not know. He need not win any prize, but he's making a contribution. And many of you who are here, and that is the beauty of talking to people at Harvard, because you are success, generally. It is very easy, difficult normally to go to some university whose name you can't pronounce and you try to be nice. At Harvard, you are all good. When you come to Harvard, when you say I'm at Harvard, you don't have to say you are good. You are at Harvard because you are good. But what do you do with your Harvardism, if you may? Beyond being at Harvard. And that is what I'm asking each one of you in your own way to find out that niche. As I've already said, you can find a niche by merely talking about it like I do. That is my contribution, talking about it and annoying you in an organized fashion. Thank you.